Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and leave your thoughts in the comments. The Last Supper. What happens when a man, blinded by ego, invites his mistress to a family dinner at the very mansion he once shared with his wife? He expects a seamless transition, a changing of the guard. He expects his powerful mother to approve, but he never expected his mother's definition of loyalty. In a single night, a multi-million-dollar empire is shaken. A life of luxury crumbles, and the woman he discarded receives the ultimate power. This is a story of betrayal, hidden motives, and the devastating consequences of underestimating the women you scorn. Brace yourselves, because this dinner is only the beginning. The air in the Sterling family mansion was always thick, heavy with the scent of old money and unspoken resentments. It clung to the heavy velvet curtains, seeped into the Persian carpets, and settled like a fine dust on the polished mahogany of the grand dining table. For Michael Sterling, this smell was that of his home, of power, of his birthright. Tonight, however, it felt suffocating, charged with an unfamiliar static. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, the charcoal gray fabric a sharp contrast to the crisp white of his shirt. At 42, he was the living embodiment of privilege, with a jawline as sharp as his business acumen, and eyes the color of a stormy sea, currently clouded by a mixture of arrogance and a fleeting, unacknowledged flicker of apprehension. 6 months. It had been 6 months since his divorce from Dr. Sophia Hayes was finalized. 6 months since she had walked out of this very mansion, not with a torrent of tears as he had expected, but with a quiet dignity that had unnerved him more than any shout. Sophia, with her brilliant mind and compassionate heart, a renowned pediatric oncologist who saved lives while he acquired companies. They had been the golden couple, a perfect fusion of intellect and influence. But Michael had found that perfection was terribly boring. He craved fire, passion, the thrill of the illicit, and he found it in Victoria Vance. Victoria was everything Sophia was not. She was a whirlwind of ambition and intoxicating beauty, a public relations specialist he had met at a conference and who had set out to conquer his world. Her laughter was loud, her dresses tight, and her eyes held a predatory gleam that mirrored his own. She was a conquest, a beautiful and dazzling prize that made him feel young and virile, a stark contrast to the comfortable, almost fraternal love he had shared with Sophia in their later years. The divorce had been swift, brutal, and surgically precise, much like the deals Michael orchestrated. He had been generous, of course. A downtown condo with a spectacular view, a financial settlement that would ensure Sophia never had to work again. Though he knew she would. Her work was her calling. And a clean slate. He had given her everything she was entitled to, and in his mind, that absolved him of all guilt. He had moved on. It was time for everyone else to as well, which led to this evening, the dinner. A simple, intimate affair. Just him, his mother, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, and Victoria. It was a necessary step, a formal introduction of the new woman in his life. His mother's approval was not just a courtesy. It was the cornerstone of the Sterling empire. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, the matriarch, held the purse strings and the final word. She was a woman of formidable intellect and an even more formidable will, who had steered the family's wealth through recessions and betrayals with an iron fist in a velvet glove. "Everything is perfect, Mrs. Lopez," Michael said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous dining room. The table was set for 3, with the family's finest china and silver gleaming under the soft light of the crystal chandelier. The elderly housekeeper, who had been with the family since before Michael was born, nodded with tight lips. Her eyes, however, told their own story. They had seen Sophia plan charity galas at this very table, her laughter warming the cold, formal space. Mrs. Lopez did not approve, but her disapproval was as silent and starched as her uniform. A sleek black car crunched on the gravel driveway. Michael's heart gave a small, treacherous leap. Victoria. He smoothed his suit jacket and walked toward the grand foyer, composing his features into a mask of confident charm. Victoria stepped out of the car like a movie star on a red carpet. She wore a crimson dress that hugged her every curve, a bold declaration against the mansion's discreet elegance. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, and her smile was dazzling, a weapon she wielded with expert precision. "Michael, darling," she purred, kissing the air beside his cheek. "This place is magnificent, even more than in the photos." Her eyes scanned the foyer, taking in the grand staircase, the ancestral portraits, the sheer brazen scale of the wealth on display. It was a look of hunger, a predator sizing up its prey. "It's my home," Michael said, simply. "Come, Mother is in the drawing room." He led her down the hall, his hand resting on the small of her back. He could feel the tension in her, the nervous energy vibrating beneath the confident facade. To her, this wasn't just a dinner, it was an audition. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling was the matriarch, and her verdict would be final. Mrs. Eleanor was seated by the fireplace, a book in her lap, though she wasn't reading it. She looked up as they entered, her gaze sharp and analytical. She was an attractive woman in her late 60s, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a regal posture. She wore a simple but exquisitely tailored navy dress, adorned only with a pearl necklace and the large, formidable diamond of her wedding ring. "Mother," Michael said, his voice a little too loud. "This is Victoria Vance. Victoria, my mother, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling." "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Sterling," Victoria said, her voice honeyed. She extended a perfectly manicured hand. Mrs. Eleanor looked at the hand for a moment before extending her own, slowly and deliberately. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice cool and neutral. Her eyes, the same stormy gray as her son's, swept slowly and deliberately over Victoria, from her expensive shoes to her professionally styled hair. It was not a look of welcome, but of appraisal, an appraisal of an asset, or perhaps a liability. "Michael has told me so much about you," Victoria continued, unperturbed. "Your work with the Arts Foundation is truly inspiring." "Is it?" Mrs. Eleanor replied, withdrawing her hand. "I find it's mostly paperwork and placating egos, something I'm sure you know a little about, Miss Vance, given your profession." The jab, subtle yet sharp, hung in the air. Michael felt a muscle in his jaw tense. This was not going to be as simple as he had hoped. He had anticipated some coolness, but this was a glacial chill. "We'll proceed to dinner," he interrupted, desperate to get them to the more structured environment of the dining table. As they settled into their seats, the silence was broken only by the tinkling of silver against china. The first course, a delicate lobster bisque, was served. Victoria, to her credit, navigated the complex array of silverware with ease, launching into a lively story about a recent public relations campaign. She was charming, witty, and beautiful. She was, on paper, a perfect match for a man of his stature. So why did her presence here feel so jarringly wrong? It was like hanging a garish piece of modern art in the middle of the Prado Museum. As Victoria talked, Michael's gaze drifted to the fourth-place setting. He had explicitly told Mrs. Lopez that it would be just 3 for dinner. He shot a questioning look at the housekeeper, who stood stoically by the sideboard. She gave an imperceptible shake of her head, her eyes blinking toward Mrs. Eleanor. It was his mother's doing. Before he could question it, the sound of the front door opening and closing resonated from the foyer. Heavy, familiar footsteps approached the dining room. Michael's blood ran cold. He knew those footsteps as well as he knew the beat of his own heart. The dining room doors swung open, and there stood Dr. Sophia Hayes. She was not dressed for a formal dinner. She wore simple black trousers and a soft cream cashmere sweater. Her dark, curly hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her face was devoid of makeup. She looked tired, as a doctor looks after a long, difficult day. But when her eyes met his, they were clear, steady, and held a strength that Victoria's manufactured confidence could never hope to match. She stopped in the doorway, her gaze taking in the scene. Michael, frozen in his chair. Victoria, with her fork halfway to her mouth, her face a mask of confusion and fury. And Mrs. Eleanor, who looked at Sophia and, for the first time tonight, smiled. A genuine, warm smile. "Sophia, darling," Mrs. Eleanor said, her voice holding an affection that had been conspicuously absent just moments ago. "Thank you for coming. We were just about to start." The silence that fell over the dining room was heavier than the ancestral portraits that lined the walls. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of shock, fury, and bewilderment. Michael felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. He looked at Sophia, his ex-wife, standing in the doorway of his family home, looking as if she had simply returned from a long day at the hospital, as had once been her routine. But now everything was different. He had made sure of that. Victoria was the first to recover. Her public relations training kicked into gear to smooth over the social grenade that had just detonated. She put down her fork with a delicate clink, her crimson lacquered nails a sharp slash of color against the white tablecloth. A strained, brittle smile spread across her lips. "Well, this is a surprise," her voice a carefully modulated purr, though her eyes, fixed on Sophia, were chips of ice. "Michael, you didn't mention we'd be having another guest." Michael could not find his voice. His gaze was locked on his mother. Mrs. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, the picture of composed serenity. Her expression gave nothing away. This was her move, her game, and he, his mistress, and his ex-wife were simply pieces on her board. Sophia, however, seemed unruffled. Her eyes, which held a deep, weary wisdom that always made Michael feel like a petulant child, scanned the room and settled on Mrs. Eleanor. "Mrs. Sterling," her voice was calm and steady, a soothing balm in the charged atmosphere. "You said it was urgent." "It is," Mrs. Eleanor replied simply, gesturing to the empty seat beside her, the seat that had always been Sophia's. "Please, join us." With a silent grace that felt like a rebuke to Victoria's flashy presence, Sophia walked toward the table. She did not look at Michael as she passed, a deliberate omission that stung more than any accusation. She gave a polite nod to Victoria, a gesture of civility that was somehow more insulting than open hostility. As she sat down, Mrs. Lopez materialized at her side, pouring a glass of water with a familiarity that spoke volumes. "I must apologize for my attire," Sophia said, her gaze directed at Mrs. Eleanor. "I came straight from the hospital. One of my patients, a little boy with neuroblastoma, had a difficult reaction to his last round of chemotherapy." She spoke of matters of life and death, with a casual gravity that made Victoria's previous chatter about brand synergy and market penetration seem completely frivolous. "And how is little Leo now?" Mrs. Eleanor asked, her tone tinged with genuine concern. "Stable for now. We have hope," Sophia said, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "He's a fighter." Michael watched the exchange, a knot of something ugly and unknown tightening in his stomach. It was jealousy. He was jealous of the easy intimacy between his mother and his ex-wife, a bond that had clearly survived his marriage. They were talking about a world he had no part in, a world of meaning and consequence that made his own pursuits feel hollow. Victoria, sensing the shift in power, attempted to regain the spotlight. "That sounds incredibly stressful." Her voice dripped with synthetic sympathy. "I can't imagine. The pressure must be immense. It reminds me of a crisis campaign we did for a pharmaceutical client whose new drug had some unexpected side effects. We had to work around the clock to manage the narrative." The comparison was so clumsy, so astonishingly tone-deaf, that a stunned silence followed. Sophia simply looked at her, her expression unreadable, before taking a slow sip of her water. It was Mrs. Eleanor who responded, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. "I'm not sure that managing a corporate narrative is the same as managing a child's life, Miss Vance," she said coldly. "But I appreciate the attempt at an analogy." Victoria's face became blotchy with red beneath her perfect makeup. She shot a desperate, furious look at Michael, silently begging him to intervene, to defend her. But Michael was trapped. To defend Victoria would be to align himself against his mother, a strategic error of catastrophic proportions. To remain silent was to abandon his chosen partner, to leave her floundering in the icy waters of his family's disapproval. He chose silence. The main course arrived, a roasted duck with a cherry reduction, a dish Michael used to love. Tonight, it tasted like ash in his mouth. The meal proceeded in a state of unbearable tension. Mrs. Eleanor and Sophia spoke in low voices about topics that excluded Michael and Victoria: the hospital's next charity gala, a new medical research paper, a shared memory of Michael's late father. They were weaving a cocoon of shared history and mutual respect, leaving him and Victoria on the outside, looking in. Michael felt a surge of childish anger. This was his house, his inner. He had orchestrated this evening to formally install Victoria in her rightful place by his side. Instead, they were making him feel like an intruder, a guest at his own table. His mother was deliberately humiliating him. And for what? To prove a point? He tried to steer the conversation back to his territory. "The Sterling merger is moving ahead of schedule," he announced to the table in general. "We're looking at a final valuation that surpasses all initial projections. It's going to be the biggest deal of the year for the company." He looked at his mother, expecting a nod of approval, a flicker of pride. Instead, she turned to Sophia. "Sophia, do you remember Mr. Sterling? A dreadful man. We were seated with him at that ghastly fundraiser 2 years ago. He spent the entire night complaining about his yacht." Sophia laughed, a low, warm sound that filled the room. "The one he called the alibi? Yes, I remember him. He told me my work was a cute hobby." Mrs. Eleanor smiled. "He's a fool. I do hope you're running him into the ground, Michael. Not because it's good business, but on principle." The dismissal of his professional triumph, the casual way they belittled a man he was about to make millions with, was infuriating. They were a united front, a fortress he could not penetrate. Meanwhile, Victoria had become increasingly silent, her former vivaciousness replaced by a sulky pout. She picked at her food, her eyes darting between the other three, a calculator running behind her gaze. She was reevaluating, reassessing the prize and the cost of her acquisition. She had likely seen this dinner as the final hurdle, the moment she would be officially welcomed into the dynasty. Instead, she had been relegated to the role of an unwanted, uninteresting interloper. The power she thought she held over Michael, the power that came from his desire, was proving to be completely useless in the face of the true authority in this house. Finally, the ordeal of the main course ended. As the dishes were cleared, Mrs. Eleanor placed her napkin on the table. The gesture felt final, like a judge striking a gavel. "Well," she said, her gaze sweeping over the three of them, "this has been enlightening." She looked at Victoria, her expression one of polite disdain. "Miss Vance, thank you for coming. I believe you now have a clearer understanding of our family dynamic." It was not a question. Then she turned to Michael, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something that looked like disappointment, a deep, maternal sadness that hurt more than her anger. "Michael, we need to talk." Her eyes finally rested on Sophia, and her expression softened completely. "And Sophia, I have something for you." Mrs. Eleanor meowed from her chair. "If you will all follow me to the study." It was an order, not an invitation. As they stood, a sense of dread washed over Michael. This was not just a dinner. It was not just a power play. It was a reckoning. And he had the terrible, sinking feeling that he was about to pay a price he had never anticipated. The final supper was over. Now came the judgment. Interactive questions. What do you think is in the folder for Sophia? What would you do if you were in Michael's shoes right now? The study was the heart of the Sterling Empire, a room that spoke of generations of power and influence. Dark oak panels lined the walls. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were filled with leather-bound volumes, and a massive partner's desk stood like an altar in the center of the room. This was Michael's father's domain, and now it was Mrs. Eleanor's. Michael had always felt like a visitor here, a prince waiting for his coronation. But the crown had never quite settled on his head. His mother had never fully relinquished control. Mrs. Eleanor walked behind the imposing desk, the worn leather of the high-backed chair sighing as she sat. She did not invite anyone else to sit. They stood before her like subjects, awaiting a decree. Michael, tense and defiant. Victoria, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality that barely concealed her seething fury. And Sophia, calm and watchful, her stillness a sharp contrast to the nervous energy radiating from the other two. From a locked drawer in the desk, Mrs. Eleanor pulled a thick folder. She placed it on the polished surface with a soft thud that echoed in the silent room. Her movements were deliberate, imbued with a sense of ceremony. She folded her hands into a steeple, her sharp, intelligent eyes fixed on her son. "Michael," she began, her voice stripped of its earlier coolness, now possessing a weary, almost clinical precision. "For the past year, I have watched you. I watched you cast aside a wife who was your intellectual and moral superior in every conceivable way. I watched you become infatuated with—" She paused, her gaze flickering to Victoria with dismissive brevity. "A woman who sees you not as a partner, but as a stepping stone, an acquisition. And you, blinded by a midlife crisis of astonishing cliché, were too arrogant to see it." Victoria gasped, a small, indignant sound. "Now you wait a minute." "You will be silent, Miss Vance," Mrs. Eleanor interrupted, her voice dropping to a low register. "You are a guest in this house, for now." Victoria's mouth snapped shut. Her eyes blazed with fury, but she held her tongue. She looked at Michael, a silent demand for him to defend her honor. Michael's jaw was so tight, a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He wanted to rage, to shout, to tell his mother she had no right. But the words died in his throat. He was paralyzed by the sudden and terrifying realization of his own powerlessness. Mrs. Eleanor returned her attention to Michael. "I had hoped you would come to your senses, that the divorce would be a shock to your system, a moment for self-reflection. Instead, you have doubled down on your folly. You have sought to install your mistress in Sophia's place, in this house, at my table. You believed your wealth and your name could simply erase your transgressions, that you could trade one woman for another as if you were changing a suit. You have shown a profound lack of judgment, of character, and most importantly, of loyalty. Not just to Sophia, but to the legacy your father and I built." Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling the facade of the powerful, confident man Michael believed himself to be. He felt naked, exposed like a foolish, reckless boy in front of his mother, his ex-wife, and the woman he had chosen in her place. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, coiled snake in his stomach. "What is this, Mother?" he finally managed to say, his voice tight. "A lecture? A public humiliation?" "It is a severe correction," Mrs. Eleanor stated calmly. She slid the folder across the desk. It stopped directly in front of Sophia. Sophia looked at the folder, then at Mrs. Eleanor, her brow furrowed with confusion. "Mrs. Sterling, what is this?" "Open it," Mrs. Eleanor instructed softly. With trembling fingers, Sophia untied the ribbon and opened the folder. Inside was a single, heavy document, filled with dense legal text. At the top, in bold, were the words, "Deed of gift." Michael's eyes widened. He stepped forward, trying to see the document, a cold chill running down his spine. A deed? A deed for what? Sophia's eyes scanned the page, her expression shifting from confusion to utter disbelief. She looked up, her mouth slightly agape, and her gaze met Michael's. In his eyes, she saw not triumph, but a deep, unsettling shock. "This house," Sophia whispered, the words barely audible. "The deed is for this house." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic pounding of Michael's heart. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The Sterling mansion, the ancestral home, the symbol of his dynasty for over a century, was his birthright. It was to be passed down to him, and then to his children. The children he and Sophia were supposed to have. "You're joking," Michael said, a harsh, incredulous laugh escaping his lips. "This is some kind of sick joke." "I have never been more serious in my life," Mrs. Eleanor said, her voice like granite. "The house was mine to give. It was part of my family's inheritance before I married your father. I have kept the deed in my name alone for 40 years, and now I am giving it to the person I trust to honor its legacy. I am giving it to Sophia." Victoria finally exploded. "You can't do that!" she shrieked. Her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. "This is Michael's house. This was supposed to be our house." The raw, possessive greed in her voice was breathtakingly ugly. In that moment, all pretense fell away, revealing the transactional nature of her affection. She was not fighting for Michael. She was fighting for the real estate. Mrs. Eleanor looked at her with something akin to pity. "It was never going to be your house, Miss Vance. You were a temporary distraction, nothing more." Michael felt the ground give way beneath him. He stumbled backward, his hand searching for the edge of the desk for support. He looked at Sophia, who was still staring at the deed as if it were a venomous snake. This wasn't just about a house. It was a complete and utter repudiation of him. His mother had not only chosen Sophia over him, she had armed his ex-wife with the ultimate symbol of his failure. She had given Sophia the power to evict him from his own life. "Why?" Michael exclaimed, the word raw with pain and betrayal. "Why are you doing this to me?" Mrs. Eleanor's stern facade finally cracked, and a deep maternal sadness filled her eyes. "Because you left me no other choice, Michael. You were destroying yourself, and you were tarnishing our name. I did this to save you from yourself. Sometimes a man has to lose everything to understand what really has value." She rose from her chair and walked around the desk to stand by Sophia. She placed a soft hand on Sophia's shoulder. "The house is yours, Sophia," she said in a low voice, her voice just for Sophia. "Free and clear. There are no strings attached. You can live in it, sell it, or burn it to the ground. It's your decision. You are the only one I trust to make the right one." Sophia looked from the deed in her hands to the stunned face of her ex-husband, and then to the furious, contorted features of his mistress. She held the power now. All of it. The deed was not just paper and ink. It was justice. It was vengeance. It was a burden of unimaginable weight. And in the deafening silence of the study, she had no idea what she was going to do with it. Interactive question. What would you do in Sophia's place? Would you sell the house, keep it, or use it for a greater purpose? Share your opinion in the comments. The chaos that followed the dinner party was a symphony of disbelief. The study, once a sanctuary of quiet power, became a pressure cooker of raw, unfiltered emotion. The deed lay on the desk, a silent testament to the bomb Mrs. Eleanor had just detonated. Its legal jargon, a death sentence to one life, and the bewildering birth of another. Victoria was the first to explode. Her shock curdled into a poisonous rage. Her carefully constructed persona of the charming, supportive partner disintegrated, revealing the furious, greedy woman underneath. "This is insane! It's theft!" she shrieked, her voice high and ugly. She turned to Michael, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing at his chest. "You're going to let her do this? You're just going to stand there and let her give our future to her?" The possessive pronouns, "our future," hung in the air, suddenly sounding hollow and transactional. Michael flinched, not from her touch, but from the raw greed in her eyes. For the first time, he saw Victoria not through the haze of infatuation, but through the cold, clear lens of his mother's appraisal. He saw a woman who had attached herself to his wealth, not his heart. The realization was a nauseating jolt, a splash of ice-cold water to the face. "Victoria, stop," he mumbled, his voice weak, unfamiliar to his own ears. He felt hollowed out, a puppet whose strings had been cut. "Stop!" she shrieked, her laugh high and hysterical. "You just got publicly emasculated by your own mother, and you're telling me to stop? She gave your home, your legacy to the woman you left. Don't you see the humiliation? She's laughing at you. Both of them are." Victoria's gaze darted to Sophia, who still stood by the desk, the deed held loosely in her hand. Sophia looked pale, stunned, as if she'd been struck by lightning. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of laughter. There was only a deep, overwhelming shock. "And you," Victoria spat at Sophia, "don't think I don't see what this is. You played the long game, didn't you? The poor abandoned wife, cozying up to the lonely old matriarch. You manipulated her." Sophia finally looked up, her eyes focused on Victoria, as if seeing her for the first time. The weariness in her expression was replaced by a flicker of steel. "You and I are very different, Victoria," Sophia said. Her voice was quiet, but it held immense weight. "You see a prize to be won. I see a family that is being torn apart. You think this is about a house? It's not." She looked at the deed in her hand, her expression one of profound conflict. "I don't know what this is, but it's not a victory." The quiet dignity of her reply seemed to enrage Victoria even more. She turned to Michael, her last desperate attempt. "Michael, fix this, call your lawyer, sue her, do something!" But Michael was no longer listening to Victoria. His world had shrunk to two people, his mother, who stood like a marble statue of judgment, and his ex-wife, who now held the keys to his entire life in her hands. He felt a primal rage building, a desperate need to reclaim his dominion, to reassert his place at the top of the food chain. He shoved past Victoria and faced his mother. "How could you?" His voice was low and dangerous. "After everything I've done for this family, for the company, you cut me off at the knees, you humiliate me in front of them. You hand over the heart of our family to a stranger." "A stranger?" Mrs. Eleanor's voice was tinged with incredulity. "Sophia has been more of a daughter to me for the past 10 years than you have been a son. She has upheld our values while you have trampled on them. She kept lives while you accumulated assets. She is not the stranger here, Michael. You are." The truth of her words was a physical blow. He had become a stranger in his own home, in his own family. The realization was so profound, so devastating, that his anger momentarily gave way to a vast, empty chasm of despair. He turned his gaze to Sophia, a different emotion now swirling in the toxic cocktail of his feelings. A desperate, pathetic plea for understanding. "Sophia, you can't accept this. You know it's wrong. This is my house." Sophia looked at him, and for a moment, he saw a glimmer of the old Sophia, the woman who had once loved him, the woman whose compassion was as boundless as her intellect. He saw pity in her eyes, and that was worse than her anger. "Your house?" she repeated in a low voice. "Was it my house, Michael? When you were booking hotel rooms with her? When you were texting her from our bed? Was it my house then? Or was it just a beautifully decorated stage for your life, where I was just another prop?" He had no answer. Her words were true, and the truth was a brutal, unforgiving thing. He had desecrated their shared space long before Victoria ever set foot in it. The tension in the room was unbearable. It was Sophia who finally broke it. She placed the deed carefully back on the desk, her hands trembling slightly. "I need air." Her voice was tight. She looked at Mrs. Eleanor. "I can't think about this right now. It's too much." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Eleanor said softly. Sophia turned and walked out of the study, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. She did not look back. The moment she was gone, the fragile truce broke. Victoria, realizing she had lost, that her investment in Michael Sterling had just been declared bankrupt, let out a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. "Fine," she snarled, grabbing her expensive handbag from a side table. "This is a circus. I'm done." She looked at Michael, her eyes filled with contempt. "When you grow a backbone, you know where to find me. But don't take too long. I have other offers." With that, she stormed out of the study and the house. The slam of the front door was a definitive and resounding end to their affair. Michael knew it, and he was surprised to find that he felt nothing but a hollow, echoing emptiness. He was alone in the study with his mother. The silence was deafening. The deed still lay on the desk, a ticking time bomb between them. "What have you done?" he whispered. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a chilling sense of loss. "I have given you an opportunity, Michael," Mrs. Eleanor said. Her voice softened, the hard edges of the matriarch giving way to a mother's pain. "An opportunity to start again, to rebuild yourself. Not your portfolio, but your character. You have been living in a gilded cage, and you have forgotten how to fly. Or perhaps you never learned." She walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens, now shrouded in darkness. "This house is a weight. It is a responsibility. It was crushing your father, and it was crushing you. You were so concerned with owning it that you forgot to live in it." Michael sank into one of the leather armchairs, the same one his father used to sit in. He felt small, insignificant. He had lost his wife, his mistress, and his home in the space of an hour. He had been stripped of everything that defined him, his wealth, his power, his name. They all felt like a costume he had been wearing, and his mother had just ripped it off. He looked at the deed on the desk. Sophia had left it. She hadn't taken it with her. A small, irrational spark of hope ignited within him. Maybe she would refuse it. Maybe she would see this as the cruel and manipulative act it was, and reject it on principle. But as he sat there, in the ruins of his life, another, more terrifying thought dawned. What if she didn't? What if she accepted it? What if, tomorrow, Dr. Sophia Hayes, the woman he had betrayed and discarded, became his landlady? The power imbalance that had so defined his entire life had just been completely and devastatingly reversed. And he had no idea how to live in a world where he was not in control. Interactive question. Do you think Michael can truly change, or will he revert to his old habits? What would be your advice to him right now? Let us know in the comments below. The days that followed the dinner were steeped in a new kind of silence. The old silence of the Sterling mansion had been one of oppressive formality and unsaid rules. This new silence was one of absence and uncertainty. It was the silence of a vacuum, a space where a life had been violently torn out, and nothing had yet rushed in to fill the void. Michael remained at the mansion, a ghost haunting the hallways of his own former kingdom. He had half expected Sophia to arrive with a lawyer and an eviction notice the next day. He had braced himself for it, rehearsing speeches of righteous indignation in his head. But she never came. She didn't call. She didn't text. The deed remained in the study, a potent symbol of her power. Yet she refused to wield it. Her inaction was a more effective form of psychological warfare than any legal maneuver. She left him in a state of suspended animation, unable to move forward, unable to go back. His mother had also retreated. She kept to her wing of the house. Their paths crossed only occasionally in the vast, empty hallways. There were no more lectures, no more confrontations. She had fired her shot and was now waiting, watching, letting the consequences of his actions play out. Her silence was one of patient expectation, and it unsettled Michael more than her anger. Stripped of his usual distractions, the thrill of the deal, the flattering presence of Victoria, Michael was left with nothing but time and the resonant silence of his own thoughts. He roamed the house like a caged animal, from the grand ballroom where he and Sophia had hosted their first charity gala, to the sun-drenched breakfast nook where she used to read medical journals on Sunday mornings. Every room held a memory of the life he had systematically dismantled. He found himself thinking of Sophia not as the wronged ex-wife or the new owner of his home, but as the woman he had once known. He remembered her passion for her work, the way her eyes would light up when she talked about a breakthrough in a patient's treatment. He remembered her quiet strength, her unshakable moral compass, her ability to find joy in the smallest things, a rare bird in the garden, the first snowfall of winter, a perfectly brewed cup of tea. These were the parts of her that he had found comfortable, predictable, and ultimately boring. Now, in their absence, he felt a deep, aching emptiness. One afternoon, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he found himself in their old walk-in closet. It had been emptied, of course. The shelves were bare, the racks naked, but the scent of her lingered, a faint, persistent fragrance of lavender and old books. It was a scent of calm, a smell he had taken for granted and now desperately missed. On the floor, in a forgotten corner, lay a single, small object. A copy of Persuasion by Jane Austen, her favorite novel, bound in worn leather. He picked it up, the cover soft and supple from years of being read and reread. He opened it, and a tiny pressed flower fell from between the pages, a daisy from the mansion's garden. A memory, sharp and painful, pierced through him. A lazy summer afternoon, years ago, when they were still happy, when he had picked that daisy and tucked it in her hair. The small, simple gesture of love felt like a relic from another life, a testament to a man who no longer was. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. What had he become? He had traded this genuine, quiet love, for the cheap, hollow thrill of Victoria's manufactured adoration. His mother was right. He was a fool. Meanwhile, Sophia was grappling with her own silence. The deed sat on her coffee table, in her sleek, impersonal downtown condo, a place that had felt like a refuge, but now felt like a waiting room. The document was a source of immense, terrifying power. Her friends, when she had cautiously told them, were unanimous. "Sell it," her colleague Maria had urged. "Take the money and travel the world. Build your own clinic. Make him pay. Literally. It was tempting. The thought of liquidating the symbol of her pain and turning it into something good, something that was entirely hers, was incredibly appealing. She could fund a new research wing at the hospital, create a foundation for the families of her young patients. She could erase the name Sterling from her life and replace it with her own legacy. But it wasn't that simple. The mansion wasn't just a house to her. It was the place where she had put down roots, the place where she had naively believed she would build a family. It was the garden where she had planted roses with Michael's father, a man she had adored. It was the library where she had spent countless hours, finding solace in the books when the losses at the hospital became too much to bear. It held memories, both beautiful and painful, that were inextricably woven into the fabric of her life. To sell it felt like selling a piece of herself. And then there was Mrs. Eleanor. Sophia knew that giving her the house was not an act of charity. It was a strategic move, a desperate attempt by a mother to save her son from himself. Mrs. Eleanor had placed an immense burden on her shoulders, trusting her to be the catalyst for Michael's redemption. It was a trust that Sophia felt deeply, but also resented. It was not her job to fix the man who had broken her. After a week of agonizing indecision, she knew she couldn't continue in this limbo. She had to face it. She had to see the house again. Not as a memory, but as a reality, as a property she now controlled. She drove to the mansion one crisp autumn afternoon. The gates, which had once felt so welcoming, now seemed ominous. She didn't use the key Mrs. Eleanor had given her. Instead, she rang the doorbell. It was Michael who answered the door. He looked diminished. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a weary uncertainty. He wore an old university sweatshirt and jeans, a far cry from his usual tailored suits. His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a mixture of fear, hope, and a deep, unsettling vulnerability. "Sophia," his voice was hoarse. "Michael," she replied, her tone even. "I think we need to talk." He stepped aside, letting her enter the grand foyer. The silence of the house enveloped them. It was no longer his home to welcome her, nor hers to claim. They were two strangers in a place that had once been their shared universe. "I haven't decided what to do," she said, breaking the silence, getting straight to the point. "I know," he said. "The waiting has been difficult." She walked into the drawing room, the scene of their disastrous dinner. She didn't sit, but stood by the large windows, looking out at the gardens. "I came to see the house, to try and figure out what it means to me now." Michael stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "And what does it mean to you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Sophia," she turned to look at him, her expression serious, "is looking. I'm not sure yet. A part of me wants to sell it and never look back. A part of me feels a responsibility to your mother and to your father's memory. And a part of me remembers the man who picked a daisy and put it in my hair in that garden. I don't know who that man is anymore, Michael. I don't think you do either." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. She was no longer talking about the house. She was talking about him, about the man he had lost somewhere along the way. For the first time in his life, Michael Sterling had no strategy, no counteroffer, no clever move to make. He was stripped of all his defenses, standing before the woman he had wronged, who now held all the power. And in that moment of complete vulnerability, a single, terrifying, yet liberating thought dawned. He had to find that man again. Not for her, not for his mother, but for himself. "I know," he said, his voice breaking with an emotion he couldn't name. "I want to find him too." The silence that followed was different again. It was no longer empty or tense. It was fragile, tentative, and it held the faintest, most delicate glimmer of a new beginning. Don't miss the conclusion to this story. Like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content. Do you think their relationship can work? What advice would you give Michael now? Let us know in the comments. The conversation in the drawing room did not magically fix anything. There was no tearful reconciliation, no grand gesture of forgiveness. But it did shift the tectonic plates of their broken relationship. The raw, open wound of the betrayal was still there. But the air of hostility had been replaced by a fragile, uncertain truce. Sophia left the mansion that day without a decision, but with a new and unsettling clarity. The question was no longer just what to do with the house, but what to do with the man who came with it. She began to visit the mansion more often, always during the day, always with a purpose. She told Michael and herself that she was taking inventory, assessing the property's condition for a potential sale. It was a practical, logical reason that provided a necessary shield for the far more complicated and emotional reality. She walked through the rooms with a clipboard, taking notes. But what she was really documenting were the ghosts of their past and the shadow of a possible future. Michael, in turn, became a reluctant keeper, a gardener in his own former paradise. He watched her from a distance, giving her space. He saw her in the garden, her fingers gently touching the petals of the roses his father had planted. He saw her in the library, running her hand over the spines of the books they had once read together. He saw a woman who was not gloating over her prize, but mourning a loss. His loss. Both of their losses. During these visits, they began to talk, not about the deed or the divorce or Victoria. They talked about small things. The dripping faucet in the upstairs guest bathroom, the family of hawks that had nested in the old oak tree, her work at the hospital, his tentative, clumsy attempts at finding a new purpose. He had taken a leave of absence from the company, a move that had sent shockwaves through the financial world. He told her he was re-evaluating, a corporate euphemism for being completely and utterly lost. One afternoon, she found him in the vast, state-of-the-art kitchen, trying to make coffee. He looked so out of place, a captain adrift in his own galley. The man who could command a boardroom of sharks was stumped by a French press. "You're doing it wrong." Her voice startled him. "You're scalding the beans." He looked at the steaming kettle with a frustrated sigh. "I've never had to make my own coffee before." The admission hung in the air, a raw confession of his lifelong privilege. The old Sophia might have felt a surge of resentment, but the woman who stood there now felt something else, a flicker of pity. He was like a man learning to walk again after a long illness. She walked over, took the kettle from his hand, and began to show him. Her movements were patient and precise. "You have to let the water cool for a minute after it boils, then pour it slowly in a spiral. Like this," as they stood side by side, their arms brushing. The simple domestic act felt both painfully familiar and utterly new. He was watching her hands, but he was also watching her face, the focused concentration in her eyes. He was seeing her again, not as a symbol of his past or a problem in his present, but as a person. "Thank you," he said when she was finished, his voice low. "It's just coffee, Michael," she replied, not cruelly. "No," he said, looking at her directly. "Thank you for not throwing me out." The unspoken question of the deed finally resurfaced, but its power had shifted. It was no longer a weapon, but a shared, complicated burden. "I haven't decided what to do," she said honestly. "Every time I think about selling it, I think about your father. He loved this place, and I think about you, a little boy running through these halls." The image took him by surprise. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had thought of him as a child, as anything other than the powerful Michael Sterling. A crack appeared in the armor he had worn for so long. "I was a lonely boy," he confessed. The words felt strange on his tongue. "My father was always working. My mother was always..." This house was my only friend. It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever said. Sophia looked at him, and for the first time, she saw past the arrogant man who had betrayed her and glimpsed the lonely boy he had been. It didn't excuse his actions, but it offered a shred of explanation. His cruelty hadn't been born of malice, but of a deep, emotional immaturity. He had never learned to connect with people, so he had learned to possess things instead. This fragile understanding became the foundation for a slow, painful process of rebuilding. Michael began to change. It started with small things. He learned to cook, his first attempts disastrous, but he persisted. He began to work on the gardens himself, firing the expensive team of landscapers. He found a quiet satisfaction in the physical work, in nurturing something back to life. He was, in a way, tending to the ruins of his own life. He also began to confront his past. He reached out to people he had wronged in business deals, not with legal settlements, but with genuine apologies. He began to read, not the Wall Street Journal, but the books in the library, the novels Sophia had loved, the stories his father had collected. He was trying to understand a world beyond balance sheets and stock prices. He was trying to build a new self from the ground up. He was becoming the architect of his own redemption. Sophia watched this transformation with a mixture of skepticism and a reluctant, growing hope. She knew that true change was a slow, arduous process. She was a doctor. She knew that healing was never linear. There were moments when the old Michael would resurface, a flash of arrogance, a flicker of entitlement, and she would withdraw, the walls around her heart rebuilding instantly. But then there were other moments. The time he called her, his voice filled with genuine excitement, to tell her that the hawks had hatched. The afternoon she came to find he had successfully repaired the old grandfather clock in the foyer, something even his father had never managed to do. The day he told her he had set up a blind trust to fund a new pediatric wing at her hospital, using his own personal money, with the only condition that it be named in honor of a patient she had lost. He had done it anonymously, without fanfare. It wasn't a grand gesture to win her back. It was an act of quiet atonement. One crisp afternoon, she found him sitting on the back patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. A copy of Persuasion lay on the table beside him. Reading it? Her voice was soft. He looked up, a faint, sad smile on his face. I'm trying to understand Captain Wentworth, a man who let pride and anger steal 8 years of happiness from him, a man who almost lost everything because he was too afraid to say what was in his heart. He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct, stripped of all artifice. I was a fool, Sophia, a blind, arrogant fool. I threw away the most precious thing in my life for nothing. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see you, and I am so, so sorry. The apology, when it finally came, was not the one she had imagined. It wasn't dramatic or desperate. It was quiet, simple, and utterly sincere. It was the apology of a man who had finally faced himself. Tears sprang to Sophia's eyes, tears she had refused to shed for months. They were not tears of sadness, but of a complex, overwhelming catharsis. The anger and resentment she had carried for so long began to melt away, not into forgiveness, but into a kind of peaceful acceptance. She sat in the chair across from him. The deed to the house, the great, unresolved question between them, suddenly seemed a minor detail. The real question was about the man sitting before her. Could a person truly change? Could a love that had been so completely broken ever be mended? She didn't have the answers, but as she watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon, she realized, for the first time, that she was willing to find out. She reached across the table and placed her hand on top of his. "Tell me about the Hawks," she said. The touch of her hand on his was a spark in the dark, a fragile connection across an abyss of pain. It was not a promise, it was not forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Don't miss the conclusion of this story. Like, share, and subscribe for more content that makes you think. Do you think their relationship can work? What advice would you give Michael? In the weeks that followed, the dynamic between them settled into a new, unwritten rhythm. The mansion was no longer a battleground or a prize. It became a neutral ground, a sanctuary where two broken people were tentatively exploring the possibility of healing. Sophia made her decision about the house. It came to her not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but in a quiet moment of clarity, while she was sitting with a terminally ill patient. The little girl, wise beyond her years, had been talking about her dream house, a fantastical place with a slide instead of stairs and a river of chocolate in the backyard. It was a house built not of brick and mortar, but of joy and imagination. And Sophia realized that was what the Sterling mansion needed to become. Not a monument to a fractured past, but a place of life, healing, and hope. She presented her idea to Michael and Mrs. Eleanor one Sunday afternoon. They sat in the sunroom, the light streaming in, illuminating the motes of dust that danced in the air, remnants of the house's old, stagnant life. "I'm not going to sell it," Sophia announced, her voice firm and sure. "And I'm not going to live in it, not as it is." Michael's heart, which had been cautiously optimistic, sank. He braced himself for the blow. "I want to turn it into something else," she continued, her eyes lighting up with the passion he remembered from when she talked about her work. "I want to create the Sophia Hayes House, a place for the families of the children at the hospital, a place where they can stay, for free, while their kids undergo long-term treatment. A home away from home, with gardens for them to walk in, a library to escape to, a kitchen large enough for them to cook their own meals, a place of peace and respite in the midst of the worst time of their lives." She looked at them, her gaze both challenging and hopeful. "The main house has more than enough room. The east wing can be converted into private family suites. We can use the ballroom for group therapy, for art classes for siblings. We can make this place useful." The audacity of the idea was breathtaking. To take this symbol of private, exclusive wealth and turn it into a beacon of communal compassion was a move of such profound moral elegance that Michael was speechless. He looked at his mother, expecting her to be horrified at the thought of her ancestral home becoming what she might consider a glorified boarding house. But Mrs. Eleanor was smiling. It was a broad, genuine smile of pure, unadulterated pride. She looked at Sophia with an expression of admiration so deep it was almost reverent. "That," Mrs. Eleanor said, her voice choked with emotion, "is the best idea I have ever heard in my life. Your father would have loved it." She turned to Michael. "Well, son, what do you think of Dr. Hayes' proposal?" All eyes were on him. This was a test, an opportunity to prove that his transformation was real. The old Michael would have seen the financial folly, the logistical nightmare, the desecration of his heritage. The new Michael saw only the beauty. "I think," he said slowly, his voice filled with a sincerity that even surprised himself, "that it's a brilliant idea, and I want to help." He looked at Sophia. "I want to run it. I'll leave the company. I'll manage the foundation. I'll oversee the renovations. I'll handle the fundraising. Let me build this with you, Sophia. Let me help you create this." It was a plea and a promise. He was offering to lay down the weapons of his old life, his career, his ambition, and pick up the tools to build her dream. He wanted to be a partner in her vision, not just a bystander. Sophia studied his face, searching his eyes for any hint of his old self, any sign that this was just another grand gesture, another acquisition. She saw none. She only saw a man desperate to atone, to create meaning from the wreckage of his past. "All right, Michael," she said softly. "Let's build it together." And so began the deconstruction of the Sterling mansion and the construction of the Sophia Hayes house. The project became their shared purpose, a new foundation on which they could build a different kind of relationship. The heavy velvet curtains were taken down, replaced by light, airy linen that let in the sun. The dark, imposing furniture was sold at auction. The proceeds went directly to the new foundation. The walls were painted in warm, cheerful colors. Michael threw himself into the work with a passion he hadn't felt since his early days in business. But this passion was different. It wasn't fueled by ego or greed, but by a genuine desire to create something good. He was a natural leader. His skills in management and finance proved invaluable. But he also learned to listen, to collaborate, to defer to Sophia's vision. They worked side by side, reviewing architectural plans, interviewing contractors, choosing paint colors. They argued over budgets and deadlines, but their disagreements were constructive, not destructive. They were partners. Mrs. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, a quiet, satisfied observer. She had moved into the guest house on the property, content to cede the main stage. She watched her son change before her eyes, becoming the man she had always hoped he would be. She had made a massive gamble, and it had paid off in ways she could never have imagined. One day, months into the renovation, Sophia and Michael were standing in the middle of the grand foyer. The floors were covered with drop cloths, the walls were bare plaster, and the air was thick with the smell of sawdust and paint. The crystal chandelier was gone, replaced by a simple modern light fixture. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess. "It's going to work, isn't it?" Michael said, a note of wonder in his voice. "Yes," Sophia replied, a smile on her face. "It will." He looked at her, standing there in her paint-splattered jeans and t-shirt, her hair in a messy bun, and he felt a surge of love so powerful it almost knocked him off his feet. It was a different kind of love than he had felt before. It wasn't the possessive, youthful infatuation of their early years, nor was it the comfortable, stagnant affection of their later marriage. It was a love born of respect, admiration, and a hard-won, shared grace. It was a love built on a new foundation. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "Sophia," he began, his voice choked with emotion. She squeezed his hand. Her eyes met his. "I know, Michael," she said softly. "Me too." They didn't need to say the words. The house, in its messy, hopeful transformation, was saying it for them. They had a long way to go. The scars of the past would always be there, a faint, silvery reminder of the pain they had endured and the lessons they had learned. But as they stood together in the ruins of their old life, they were no longer looking back. They were looking forward to the new, beautiful thing they were building together. The inauguration of the Sophia Hayes house was a quiet affair, a sharp contrast to the lavish high society galas the Sterling mansion had once hosted. There were no reporters or celebrities, just the hospital staff, a few key donors, and the first 3 families who would call the house their temporary home. The autumn sun cast a warm, golden glow over the building, which now seemed to breathe a lighter, more welcoming air. Sophia stood on the newly constructed front porch, addressing the small crowd. She spoke not of fundraising goals or architectural details, but of hope, community, and the simple human need for comfort in times of crisis. As she spoke, Michael stood just behind her, out of the spotlight. He watched her, his heart swelling with a pride that was pure and selfless. This was her vision, her triumph. He was simply a humble contributor, and that was more than enough. After the speeches, they mingled with the guests. Michael found himself talking to a young father whose 6-year-old daughter was battling leukemia. The man, his eyes hollowed with fear and exhaustion, talked about the relief of having a quiet, beautiful place to stay, just minutes from the hospital. "I can cook my daughter her favorite meal tonight," the man said, his voice breaking. "In a real kitchen. You don't know what that means. It's a small piece of normal in the middle of all this chaos." "I'm glad we could help," Michael said, his own voice thick with emotion. For the first time, he understood wealth not as a measure of power, but as a tool for compassion. The numbers on a balance sheet were insignificant compared to the look of gratitude in this man's eyes. Later, as the evening wound down, he found his mother sitting in the garden, on a bench overlooking the rose bushes. "Your father would be so proud, Michael." Her voice was soft. "Not just of this house, but of you. I couldn't have done it without you, Mother," he said, sitting down beside her. "Your intervention was brutal, but it was necessary. You saved me." "No, Michael," she corrected him softly. "I only opened the door. You were the one who had the courage to walk through it, and Sophia was the one who showed you the way." Their conversation was interrupted by a sleek, familiar car pulling into the driveway. It was Victoria. Michael's body tensed. He hadn't seen or spoken to her since the night she had stormed out. He had no idea why she was here. Victoria got out of the car. She looked different. The loud, aggressive glamour was gone. She wore a simple, elegant dress, and her makeup was understated. She looked older, more serene. She walked up to them cautiously, her eyes on Michael. "Michael," she said, her voice quiet. "Can we talk for a minute?" Michael looked at his mother, who gave a slight nod. He walked with Victoria to a more private corner of the garden. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she began, her hands twisting the strap of her handbag. "I just heard about what you'd done with the house, and I had to see it. It's incredible. Thank you," she said, her tone neutral. She took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize, Michael, for how I acted. I was awful that night. I showed my true colors, and they weren't pretty. When you lose everything, it gives you a lot of time to think. And I realized that I didn't love you. I loved the idea of you, the power, the money. I was so busy trying to conquer your world, I never stopped to think if I actually wanted to live in it." She looked him in the eye, and for the first time he saw not a predator, but a person, flawed and insecure. "I'm sorry for the part I played in your pain, and in Sophia's. She's a better woman than I could ever hope to be." The quiet apology was unexpected, and to Michael's surprise, sincere. He saw that she too had been on a journey of self-discovery. Her loss had forced her to confront her own emptiness, just as his had forced him to confront his. "I appreciate that, Victoria," he said, and he meant it. "I wish you all the best." "You too," she said. With one last sad smile, she turned and walked back to her car, leaving his life forever. The last ghost of his past had been laid to rest. He found Sophia in the library, now a cozy, welcoming space, with comfortable armchairs and reading lamps. She was showing a little girl, the sibling of a patient, a book with beautiful illustrations. The girl was laughing, her face lit up with joy. He leaned against the doorway, watching them, his heart full. This was it. This was the meaning he had been searching for. It wasn't in a boardroom or a stock ticker. It was here, in the quiet moments of human connection, in the simple act of bringing comfort to others. When the little girl had run off to find her parents, Sophia looked up and saw him. She smiled, a warm, easy smile that reached her eyes. "Was it a good day?" she said. "It was a perfect day," he replied, walking toward her. He stopped in front of her, taking her hands in his. The space between them, once an abyss, was now just a breath. The love he felt for her was a quiet, steady flame, a lighthouse that had guided him home. "Michael," Sophia said, her voice low and serious, "I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know the past will always be a part of our story, but I have to ask anyway. Can we have a future? Can we start a new story right here, in this house we built together?" She looked into his eyes, the stormy gray eyes she had once loved, then hated. And now she loved them again, in a new and different way. She saw the lonely boy he had been, the arrogant man he had become, and the good, compassionate man he was now. She saw his journey, his atonement, his redemption. She thought of persuasion, of Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth, of second chances and a love that was deeper and truer for having been lost and found again. "Yes, Sophia," she whispered, her voice filled with all the love and hope in the world. "Yes, let's start our new story." He leaned in and kissed her. A kiss that was not about passion or possession, but about partnership, respect, and a deep, shared grace. It was a kiss that sealed the past and opened the door to the future, in the heart of the home, built on the ashes of their old life. They had come full circle, finding their way back not to what they had been, but to something stronger, truer, and infinitely more beautiful. A year later, the Sophia Hayes house was humming with a quiet, steady rhythm of life. The initial novelty had worn off, replaced by the comfortable hum of routine. Families came and went, their stays marked by the ebb and flow of treatments, of good days and bad. The house absorbed it all, the tears, the laughter, the whispered conversations late at night, the shared meals in the large community kitchen. It had become exactly what Sophia had envisioned, a sanctuary, a place of solace. Michael had found his calling not in grand fundraising gestures, but in the small, daily acts of service. He was the one who fixed the broken toaster, who drove a mother to the pharmacy in the middle of the night, who sat with a shell-shocked father in the library, offering not advice, but simply sharing the silence. The residents didn't know he was Michael Sterling, the former financial titan. They simply knew him as Michael, the kind, quiet man who ran the house and always seemed to know what they needed before they asked. He had traded his power suit for a tool belt, his corner office for a small, cluttered desk in what used to be the butler's pantry. And he had never been happier. Sophia continued her work at the hospital, but her life was no longer consumed by it. She left her work at the door when she came home each night, to the guest house on the property where she and Michael now lived. Their life together was a quiet architecture of happiness, built on a foundation of shared purpose and mutual respect. They were not the golden couple they had once been. Their life was not a glossy magazine spread. It was real, messy, and infinitely more precious. Their love was not a fiery passion, but a deep, enduring partnership. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of tea, just the way she liked it, after a long shift. It was in the way she would listen, truly listen, as he talked about his day, celebrating the small victory of a repaired boiler or the smile of a child. They had learned to communicate not just with words, but with gestures, with silences, with a shared understanding that had been forged in the crucible of their past. Mrs. Eleanor, now in her late years, was a constant, gentle presence. She spent her afternoons reading to the children in the garden or teaching them how to play chess in the sunroom. She had found a new role, not as the formidable matriarch of a dynasty, but as the beloved grandmother of this strange, wonderful, extended family. The harshness in her had softened, replaced by a quiet serenity and contentment. She had gambled everything on her son's character, and in doing so, had not only saved him, but had also found her own redemption. One crisp autumn evening, exactly 2 years after that fateful dinner, Michael and Sophia sat on the back patio of the main house, watching the residents prepare for a small Halloween party. Children in costumes ran across the lawn, their laughter echoing in the twilight. "Do you miss anything?" Sophia asked softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "The old life? The deals? The power?" Michael thought for a moment, watching a little boy dressed as a superhero chase a girl dressed as a fairy. "No," he said. His voice was filled with a certainty that was absolute. "I was playing a game, Sophia. A game where you win by accumulating things, but I never felt like I had enough. Now," he gestured to the scene before them, "this is real. This has meaning. I don't own any of it, but I feel richer than I've ever been in my life." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. "I spent so many years trying to build an empire that I didn't realize the only thing worth building was a life. With you." She smiled, her heart full. "We built a good life, Michael Sterling." "No," he corrected her, a soft smile playing on his lips as he kissed the top of her head. "We built a great life. The past was not forgotten. The scars remained, a faint, silvery reminder of the pain they had endured and the lessons they had learned. But they were no longer a source of anger or regret. They were simply a part of their story. The story of how two people lost everything only to find something far more valuable in the ruins. They had learned that true power was not in what you possessed, but in what you gave. And that the strongest foundations were not built on wealth or privilege, but on the quiet, resilient, and extraordinary power of love and second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more.